The Orbea Rise platform has earned a massive following here in the USA. It's often the best-selling lightweight EMTB, and after having ridden 3 different iterations of Rise, I definitely understand why. Earlier this year, Orbea announced a much-anticipated update to the Rise. Now they've separated the Rise family into 2 different models, the SL and the LT. The SL is built for other people in other places, but the LT is, well, built for what I do, riding trails and recklessly pretending they are dirt jumps and pump trims. Today is again new bike day, but we've already seen this bike on the channel, with one difference. When we did see this bike on the channel, it was out in Spain. In my opinion, this is what an e-bike really should be. So I'm very excited to crack this thing open and ride it here on my home soil in the USA. Oh boy. Before we pull this out of the box, I want to give a huge thank you to the sponsor of this video, Jensen USA. Jensen is an online retailer in the United States of America for Orbea bikes. They have Orbea Rise LTs in stock now. When you order a Rise LT or any bike from Jensen, they've already unboxed it, gone through it, got it set up, adjusted the gears, made sure everything's dialed in, and then they pack it in their own Jensen USA box, which is bigger than this, but it allows for a much easier, more seamless experience for you to pull the bike out and get on the trail. So I'll link to the Orbea Rise LTs over at Jensen USA. You can find that link in the description just below this. And anything you purchase from Jensen, whether it's some chain lube, some Endura clothing, whatever it may be, that'll help earn me a small commission, which is a big part of how we make all these videos happen. Okay, thank you Orbea for the loaner bike. Let's get some looks. Okay, here it comes. It's pink, I love it. Oh my goodness, this is the fancy one. I was not expecting the fancy one. Custom matching decals. Got the bike in the stand, here we go. It's gonna be quite a bit of assembly. Headset cable routing, electronic, shifting, some fancy parts. I'm gonna get off to wrenching. We'll catch up once this thing's back together. If you didn't already know, the company Orbea is an employee-owned cooperative from the Basque region of Spain. They've been in business since back in 1840, focusing on bicycles since the 1930s. Back in the 2000s, Orbea was better known as a road bike brand, at least here in the USA. By around 2008 or so, the carbon Orca model could be seen in front of coffee shops all over the country. That said, Orbea has had an active presence in the European mountain bike scene for decades, and they really hit the big time as the Enduro World Series gained steam about 10 years ago. Today, Orbea's US headquarters is in Boulder, Colorado, and the brand has really enjoyed some great success in the fun, dirt side of the sport. The success has primarily been with the Rayón Enduro bike and the Rise lightweight EMTB. Speaking of Rise, it's worth mentioning that Orbea was the 3rd company ever to make an SL EMTB. French company Lapierre produced the first, Specialized had the second, and in late 2020, Orbea made waves with the original Rise Carbon. I mention that because the first generation EMTB will never be perfect. Orbea has already made several big updates to the Rise platform. This means Orbea is absolutely a market leader with SL EMTBs. Before we get into any details, let's back up and remember the intended use of this bike. And to get there, we should mention the meat-powered equivalent.
So slippery.
While you've likely heard of the Rise, you may not have heard of the acoustic equivalent, the Occam. It would be fun to insert a pun about a good shave from Occam's razor here, but the bike has some complexities. For example, headset cable routing, and that provides more irony than the fact that globally, the most shoplifted book happens to be the Bible. The Occam was released over a decade before the Rise, and the Rise took what the Occam started and added a motor. Both the Rise and the Occam are mid-travel, all-around trail bikes. I first rode an Occam back in 2020 and felt that even though it was quite a bit longer travel, in reality, it had a similar intended use as something like an Ibis Ripley, or even the prior generation Santa Cruz Hightower. These relatively lightweight trail bikes are equally as capable in the backcountry as at more common mountain bike-specific trail networks. All these bikes sport enough suspension travel to deal with unmaintained, rock-strewn trails, geometry that climbs with efficiency, and can still descend steep and unpredictable pitches. At the same time, these bikes aren't too much to handle on flat, technical bits of trail. The Occam fit all that usage very, very well. which is a really long-winded way of saying this is not an enduro bike. If you ask it enduro questions, it'll reply in lightweight trail bike answers. Sometimes these are clever, other times cantankerous. For 2023, Orbea further segmented the Occam into two more specific builds, the lighter weight, more distance-oriented SL, and the more stout, robust LT. I definitely prefer the LT. A year later, and as you may have likely expected, the Rise follows the same progression as did the Occam, splintering into SL and LT variants. The LT is again the model I care about, and it's enough bike to conquer local trail networks, but it's also well equipped for more rugged backcountry exploration. It is not built as an enduro race bike, nor as a bike park slayer. For the announcement of the SL LT updates, I did a first look video about the Rise LT. Orbea flew me out to the Pyrenees, and holy trail jibbing Batman, I had a wonderful time with the new bike. What stoked me out most was that the press camp took place on some rugged and rocky trails that had once been used at an EWS event back in 2015. I'm a sucker for a good trail with a fun story behind it. These trails were great, and they were a perfect example of the trail flavors that best appease the Rise's trail appetite. A significant part of the Orbea Rise story is the use of a Shimano motor. I should mention here that Shimano does sponsor me. Orbea has previously used a less powerful tune for this motor along with an appropriately smaller battery. The idea was less weight by being more efficient, and the rider would have to carry more of their own share of the uphill duties. The result was a bike that had less weight extending up the down tube, and the weight it did carry is quite centralized around the cranks. This creates a sensation that when it's time to jump, that you're tossing around a mere standard meat-powered machine. When it's time to scoot back up to the top of the mountain for that second lap, you end up feeling like Lance Armstrong back in 2005, zipping uphill at 2x the natural output, and with still more effort put in than the chairlifts we use on full-power EMTBs. Generally, the Rise idea is a win-win, and you don't need to worry about paying off an Italian doctor with the same name as a particular car company. The Rise LT I'm riding first came from Orbea with a little 420 watt-hour battery. Then I was lucky enough to secure a 210 watt-hour range extender. While I have not yet done a scientific range test, I can say, with the 420 battery, the bike is easily good for about a 2-hour, 3,500 foot of vertical ride in trail mode. With the extender, we're looking at close to 3 hours of ride time, summiting 5,000 feet of vertical. Temperature and how hard you pedal will affect these numbers. I even got to borrow a proper 630 watt-hour battery, but haven't had a chance to install it yet. Clearly, I need to do a follow-up video with a proper range analysis of all these batteries. I do expect to average between 6,000 and 8,000 feet of vertical with that big battery plus the extender. When I first rode this bike, it was equipped with one of these, the big old 630 watt-hour batteries. And this is hefty, but it's not insane. So I'm gonna swap this in here when I get a chance. And if you wanna see the updated video where I compare the range of this to that versus how far I can total go with this and the range extender for the Mega 840 watt-hour option, well, hit the subscribe button and stay tuned. I'll probably get that up in like late January or maybe even late February, depending on Mother Nature and how good the snow is at Mount Baker. Let's move on to the motor. Of all the various Shimano e-bike motors I've tried, this one is the best yet. It's far quieter than the Bosch motor I rode on the Norco, and the Shimano motor applies its power more smoothly and intuitively. I have ridden the EP8RS in the full power mode, which is a hoot on such a light bike. But still, 85 Newton meters of power is more than a 2.5-inch wide rear tire can really get into the dirt in a tough situation. While range isn't great in full boost, it's neat to have that trick hidden up your sleeve. In the real world, with day-to-day riding, I feel that massive extra power is not worth it, so I keep it limited to the same 60 Newton meter output that I use on the Shuttle SL. With SL EMTBs, range is too impacted by using boost mode, and the middle power mode trail is plenty of assist for my taste. But this is all great, and before I can go any further, I do have a few complaints that have arisen since riding the LT here in the local PNW trails. Perhaps my biggest complaint about this bike is to find out how much battery is remaining. You have to attach your phone, and that takes a long time. I'll zoom you in so you can see exactly how long it takes. Now, there is an indicator light that remains green on the controller until you have a whole 20% battery remaining. But that doesn't help anyone make decisions mid-ride before dropping in for another lap or not. Maintenance. Oh, full battery. Okay. That's how long that takes. Next complaint, the switch to turn the bike on and off is tiny and hard to use. All right, let's turn this bike on so we can go for a ride. Didn't turn on. Didn't turn on. Hold. No. Oh, that got it. The light is a little bit delayed behind the button, and the button's small and hard to get to, so not a very reassuring on-off switch. The bike has headset cable routing, meaning it's quite the hassle to install an aftermarket stem. The frame's torsional stiffness is somewhat lacking for my taste. And finally, the rear suspension is far too linear for aggressive use with the stock coil rear shock. Now, let's go in depth on what matters the most, the stiffness and the suspension. For my other video, I put in a lot of time on the bike, but it was all at that press event in Spain. Those trails were super rocky and natural, but I'd never ridden them before. Where I ride more locally, trails are more heavily built up with berms and jumps all over the place. I alluded to the frame stiffness in the first look videos, I did notice it then, but at that point I didn't find it to be a huge problem. 8,000 kilometers away, here in the Northwest, and that lack of torsional frame stiffness is indeed more noticeable. Compared to my main SL EMTB this year, the Pivot Shuttle SL, the softer feeling frame of the Rise is less confidence-inspiring. Now, the older Rise models also weren't all that stiff, but they didn't have geometry this good. So now the light bike is getting ridden harder than ever, making this trait stand out. This brings us right back to the intended use discussion, and it's why I talked about it so much at the beginning of the video. Anyhow, I'm 175 pounds or 79 kilos, so likely heavier than the expected average buyer of a bike like this. Another issue that popped up was the stock coil shock. I would constantly bottom out when jumping. The solution was to upgrade to a Fox Float-X along with a 0.8 volume reducer. This was both a massive size spacer and a massive size ride improvement. I feel ready to send substantially more with the upgraded Float-X. I did reach out to Cane Creek, and they instructed me that the Rise LT does not fit the Taigon shock. Shucks, because this would be a great application for that one. And finally, the Rise LT is low. Both front end low and the bottom bracket height is low. I caught a ton of pedals and even had a good tumble off the trail due to catching a crank arm on a rock. That's what we got going on. This trail's just, no, is that rock right there. At 440 millimeters long, the rear end isn't super short, so in turn, I'd like a higher front end to make it easier to get the bike up onto the rear wheel. The Rise is a pretty low stack height, and with the internally routed wiring, it's a hassle to fit taller bars. The 1-Up carbon bars have helped with their 35 mils of rise, but I'd still like even more height. Now, let's move on to a couple of quick comparisons. First, let's compare to the Norco Fluid VLT. The Norco is sized very differently than the Orbea, to the point that at 5 foot 8 inches tall, or 174 centimeters, the size S3 Fluid is 18 millimeters longer than my medium-sized Rise LT. I much prefer Orbea's sizing, as they have smaller gaps in the range, and they're pretty close to my preferred 460 millimeter measurement. Next, the Norco holds its weight further forward, and it rides like it's a much heavier bike than it actually is. Whereas the Orbea has a much better weight distribution, creating a more balanced feel. And finally, the Bosch SX motor on the Norco isn't nearly as good as the Shimano on the Orbea. However, the Fluid has its merits. It's absolutely more stout and bomber, and it's certainly the bike I'd pick if I weighed over 200 pounds or planned to hit more aggressive terrain. I even rode the Fluid at the Whistler Bike Park, and it felt pretty good for that. I would definitely hesitate to do that with the Orbea Rise. Next, let's compare it to my beloved little Pivot Shuttle SL. That bike is so good, but it took me a bit to get it set up. With a 160 fork and a 1-degree angle adjust headset, the Shuttle SL is a lot more competent of a descender. Even though it's 20 millimeters less rear travel, it is so much more solid that I often felt safer pushing limits on the Shuttle SL. Next up, the rear end length of the Shuttle SL is awesome! I normally whine about Pivot's short back ends, not on the Shuttle SL. The short stays of the Shuttle make it feel even lighter than it already is, and Pivot has located their weight really, really well. The biggest drawbacks to the Shuttle SL are range and power. Phasma doesn't yet make a range extender, and it's been rumored for years, but it's also never appeared.
And next, that Phaswa is also a lower power motor, which is necessary for its smaller battery. If you're a heavier rider, you'll absolutely appreciate the available 85 Newton meters from the Orbea, along with the option to run a full 840 watt-hours of onboard battery. Choices and choices. The Rise LT is a weapon for its intended use, traditional trail riding. But somehow, for what I actually do, the bike is a little undergunned. Is this a deal breaker? Absolutely not. There is more than one way to crack an egg, and Orbea has made a wonderfully unique omelet with their recipe. I would definitely recommend this bike, but I'd absolutely want to communicate these complaints I had before you end up shelling out the coin.
Huge thanks to my friends over at Orbea for loaning me this Rise LT. I've not only ridden this bike quite a bit, but we've used it to tow up the hill when we're shooting with a non-EMTB, and it makes getting out into the backcountry with heavy camera bags a lot easier. Also, big thanks to Jensen USA who sponsored this video. I couldn't do hardly any of what I do these days without the support of my friends over at Jensen USA, and they're a top online retailer for Orbea bikes. I'll link to all the Orbea Rise models available now at Jensen USA, and you can find those links down in the YouTube description just below me here. If this is the kind of video you like watching, you find it enjoyable, you want to just think mountain bikes for 10, 20 minutes, well, go ahead and give my channel a subscribe. Hit that little subscribe button. I'd really appreciate it. All right, thanks everyone. I'll see you down in the comments. Peace and wheelies. Oh. Couldn't even see where the trail was.